Hello and welcome to another episode of Battlefield Breakdown. This week we again will talk about the Kursk offensive, but in more detail. The Kursk offensive and the Pokrovsk offensive, the Russian offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, how wise was it for Ukraine to send additional forces into Kursk, exposing the eastern flank, possibly allowing Russian forces to progress? This is a heated debate now. It's heated in Ukraine, it's heated elsewhere. However, there are a lot of misconceptions around this. First of all, yes, Kursk was a risky endeavor. Ukrainian planners and Ukrainian officials knew about the risk. It's not that they discovered they would take the risk by yesterday. That was known. It was calculated. However, it's also oversimplified that just because of Kursk, Russia made progress in Pokrovsk and Donetsk and New York. These are complex problems and they have a lot of reasons why they happened that basically came together, unluckily for Ukraine in this regard. First of all, let's go to the east and zoom into the Russian side. If you look at the map, of course, the breakthrough in Ocheretinya at the beginning of May, I think it was 6th of May, provided Moscow with an opportunity to penetrate deeper into the Ukrainian perimeter. Ukraine, unfortunately, at the time could not contain the breakthrough. It could not mount a counter-offensive or counter-attack to erase the minor Russian breakthrough through their own lines, because at the time it was lacking artillery shells, and also a lot of the brigades lacked the manpower back then. And the Russians have systematically widened this breakthrough, and by beginning to end of May, Ukrainian military experts and general staff started to talk about a Pokrovsk vector of the Russian offense that happened in and around Ocheretinya. So, of course, Ukrainians were very well aware what the Russians were aiming for and where they were going to. Pokrovsk, just to summarize, is a very important logistical hub. It is playing the role in the southern sector that Kramatorsk plays in the northern sector. Southern sector, basically from Volodya in the very south, then up to Kasiv Yar. All the important supplies are provided through Pokrovsk because you have two main rail lines going into the city, and you have also a lot of well-built roads going into the city, so it's easy to use it as a hub for repairs, for supplying ammunition, etc. And this offensive is going on and was slowly creeping forward. When Ukraine decided to conduct the Kursk offensive, and they started planning probably in mid to end May for the whole endeavor. This is probably just tracing on the communication that probably the plans were set up. They knew that they will already have a problem for Pokrovsk, so it's not unknown. They thought ways to at least contain the Russian progress in the east, that by establishing defensive lines, as well as moving additional ammunition and drone troops and other troops that were in the beginning of forming, because mobilization was going on and new brigades were being formed, and that some of the forces should go there. However, here the first intersection started. Ukraine at the time set up 14 new brigades from men particularly mobilized under the amended mobilization law. 14 brigades, that is more than the roughly 7 brigades or elements of 7 brigades that were sent to Kursk. And these 14 brigades, because new brigades, forming them, training them as cohesive elements of battle takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. Actually, just setting up these new brigades drew more forces away from Donbass, because the soldiers that formed the new brigades did not reinforce the existing brigades fighting actually on the front line, but went into a new training endeavor to form these brigades. That cost already more than the whole Kursk offensive. The other problem, of course, is Ukrainian forces at the time were exhausted. But we also see, and there's now a huge blame game going on in sort of Ukraine's military blogosphere, if I may call them so, on whose fault, whose brigade's fault, some of the progress of the Russian forces around Pokrovsk was. I've talked about Ochrotiny before. Ochrotiny basically was a failed rotation. Ukraine rotated its forces from moving troops from less active parts of the front into more active parts in the front and trying to relieve brigades that were actually fighting at the more active parts of the front to replenish them and give them some rest. These maneuvers sometimes went wrong. There was issues of bad coordination, orders that didn't get through, orders that didn't get properly followed, orders that were inconclusive in the first place, and sometimes just badly executed. And that happened during the whole fight for Pokrovsk, unfortunately, multiple times. Also, when retreating coordination issues happened, electronic warfare blocked Ukrainian troops, so Ukrainian electronic warfare blocked Ukrainian troops from communicating because they did not properly synchronize frequencies. Withdrawal, or the attempt for an organized withdrawal, left all gaps in the front line because certain sectors were not dealt with. All these are, of course, mistakes that happen, unfortunately. And the reason why they happen is also known for quite some time. The Ukrainian army, if you look at the peacetime structure of the Ukrainian army before the full-scale invasion, you will discover that they have 27 full-sized combat brigades that were either already formed or just being formed, plus 4 very high readiness reserve brigades, and then they had 31 territorial defense brigades that were just being formed on paper in 2021. That basically was the core of the professional Ukrainian army that did so well at the beginning of the war. All these high readiness combat brigades were staffed with contract soldiers. They had multiple tours through the Donbass. These were highly combat experienced troops. But then came mobilization, and Ukraine had a huge border from sort of the Polish-Belarusian border. Ukrainian border stretches all the way down to Donbass, and then sort of the front line, and then down to the Dnieper River. You had at some point a very active front line also on the western bank of the Dnieper River. So you had the demand for a lot of brigades to cover this huge front line or dangerous border that Ukraine suspected of possibly becoming another front line. In the way of doing so, of course, they had to dilute the quality of the force, because if you quickly ramp up your structure, you need to find officers, you need to find specialists, you need to find planners. Leading a brigade is obviously more difficult than leading a battalion or a platoon or a company. Much more men involved, much more equipment. It's much more of a logistical challenge, and it's much more of a coordination challenge. And Ukraine did not have the pre-war stock of peak-trained reserve officers to fill all these gaps. They tried to recruit officers from wherever they could get them. Some of these officers haven't been in the armed force for a very long time. Some of them have been educated a very long time ago under a education system that was still very much Soviet dominated. They have lived through a very different military culture inside Ukraine. They have handled forces that looked differently, at least in the point of a table of organization, structure, etc. They have not gone through the Donbass war experience. Sometimes Ukraine made people commander who were promoted to an officer's rank, like major or colonel, because of their civilian qualification, like a construction specialist that was promoted colonel, because colonel is the kind of academic equivalent rank of a chief engineer in the armed forces, but he never had the training as a, if I may call it, a combat colonel, a colonel that is supposed to lead a regiment or a brigade. And all these problems, of course, led to some brigades that were established before the war, or that could draw from volunteers and from officers and specialists that were part of the Donbass war and are highly experienced, doing very well. But then you have other brigades that do not so well, and where you hear a lot of complaints about the local leadership and complaints about coordination. That is because these people have been pushed into these roles with lacking the experience and the training that should have been there. And that unfortunately also accelerated the Russian push into Pokrovsk. Now, would that have not happened had Ukraine not conducted the Kursk Offensive? That is, of course, hard to guess because it's alternative reality. The Kursk force was not so hugely big. This was more a raid than a huge offensive. Yes, of course, they contained some of the most experienced mobile forces Ukraine had at the time, or at least had in reserve at the time. Even if Ukraine now redirects them towards the east, or redirects some of them towards the east, which I think is actually already happening, or has started happening a week ago, they, of course, will have lost some people and material there. But nevertheless, you should keep in mind that this force was relatively small, although, of course, the lack of this force in the east did probably accelerate Russian gains. It is not, by far not, the only explanation why these gains have happened. Also, if you compare Ukrainian operative grouping commands with Western Corps size command, which is what they roughly represent, you will notice that a Western Corps command is much smaller than a Ukrainian operative grouping command. Now, that is also explained by peacetime structures and the limitation of people and infrastructure, command and control equipment to actually set up more commands on the Ukrainian side. I actually highly regard those people, at least that I met in my trips in Ukraine, working at the operative grouping command level. They're serious officers and they're good people. There's no doubt about that. But you have to see that they command a lot of forces. And when things go wrong, a commander usually looks at the problem and goes there and tries to deal with it. That is the commander's responsibility. You can, of course, do that if you have roughly up to 7 brigades you lead under your command. If they become more, and if more problems appear at the same time, you can only go to one place and you can basically shiver around some amount of problems. But if a front on such a wide range becomes chaotic, it is really, really hard for a commander to reestablish control, especially in such a hugely overstretched organization. This is not something I would suggest that the people are below quality. That's a sheer issue of quantity. Even the best commander cannot at the same time handle too much problems at once. It's just not humanly possible. The problem is that during some phases of the Russian offensive on Pokrovsk and Ukrainian withdrawal to other lines of defense, at the same time, multiple brigades showed signs of possible collapse. And then, of course, a commander has a really tough choice where to insert reserves, where to kind of tackle the problem that is most urgent. And you have a high chance that you miss another brigade also struggling that then will have to withdraw or will be defeated. And of course, that unfortunately, that happened. That is a situation, a kind of friction, as Clausewitz said, that continuously and always happens in war. It would be completely insane to expect these frictions that happened in every military organization throughout military history not to happen in Ukraine. They're only humans. There is only so far you can do. The other question, of course, that arises is, why did Ukraine conduct the Kursk offensive? Now, in a previous episode, I talked about the uncertainty related to the US elections. Europeans, as you can see, are not able to substitute the US if the US drops out. It's by far the most important supplier of military assistance, but beyond the supplement, future assistance pretty much hangs in the balance on where presidential elections may go and where the congressional elections or partial elections will go. So Ukrainians didn't know. But why didn't they conduct that in autumn? Well, we got basically some hints. For example, US newspapers reported that the Kursk offensive collapsed the prospect of a partial ceasefire, saying that Russia would not attack Ukrainian critical infrastructure and Ukraine would not attack Russian oil refineries. Now let's just take this piece and just dissect what it actually means. Russia not attacking Ukrainian critical energy infrastructure, we saw on the Kiev Children's Hospital, that doesn't mean that they will not attack something else. Given the insufficient level of military supply on air defense systems and a constant delay in both ground-based air defense and fighter deliveries to Ukraine. Even if Russians would bomb something else, it would pose a severe problem for Ukraine. Of course, energy infrastructure is the most critical part, but defense industry is equally critical. There are numerous of other infrastructure stuff that Russia will bomb or claim it had bombed that would not be part of this ceasefire agreement. On Ukrainian side, giving up hitting Russian oil refinery would considerably lift pressure off the Russian economy, which is overheating. Oil and gas products are still the mainstay of Russian state finances, particularly oil. And there is no other raw material on this planet that has such a direct correlation to inflation ratios than gas. If you, by bombing refineries, increase the Russian gas price, you heat up inflation. As mentioned in previous episodes, this is one of Ukraine's theory of victory, to overheat the Russian war economy and at least make Russian recruitment of personnel and fighters, which is exclusively based on the prospect of earning money, impossible. The balance of such a ceasefire agreement would be on the Russian side. They would gain a lot because they would be relieved of one of the most dangerous threats to the war effort, while Ukraine has some gains of being slightly better in terms of electricity supply, but will face other bombardments. You can easily see that such an idea was not the idea of the Ukrainian presidential administration. That, of course, was an idea of Washington, D.C. And you also need to see Washington's concern about the oil price before the elections. You can basically connect the dots where this comes from. So on the other hand, and now I'm coming back to the date, why Ukraine chose to attack so early? Why didn't they choose to do the Kursk endeavor in November when there are presidential elections, or whenever a possible President Trump would present its peace plan? Why did they do so in the summer of this year? It seems that some elements of the Biden administration, in terms of forcing Ukraine into ceasefire negotiations against the strategic interest of Kiev, are not too much different from what Trump has proposed in its peace plan, under quotation mark. And if that is the case, of course, then inserting a moment of direct leverage on the Russians to force them to reconsider their terms of negotiations is something that is politically pretty logical to do. Militarily, of course, there's another logic. But again, if we are talking about a negotiation process between Russia and Ukraine, the operation makes perfect sense. On this, and that is sort of my last big appeal to the Western audience. Yeah, our societies and states have an election calendar, and there are domestic reasons. The French don't have a government. The British are in financial difficulties. We all have our problems. But compared to Ukraine's existential problems, they are rather minor. And if we start to push Ukraine around to negotiate here and there, to limit the war to the needs of our domestic election calendar and not to the calendar of the Russian-Ukrainian war and Ukraine's urgent defense needs, we're in for certain defeat. This kind of capital-steered micromanagement happened in Afghanistan and happened in other conflicts. It never worked well. War is war, and once there is war, the logic of war is dictating what you need to do and what not you need to do. And this kind of premature negotiation nonsense is exactly what you not should do, even if you want to achieve a negotiated settlement. Doing that at this stage of the war, where it's completely and entirely unrealistic that Moscow would actually engage in serious negotiations, would spoil even that effort. So stay tuned for another episode, and on this unhappy news, goodbye.